at Google, within the House Department of Health and Human Services, within the U.S. House and Senate, Health and Human Services during the Obama administration, and more. Her public service orientation extends to positions on numerous boards, most importantly for us, the board of Impact100 DC, where we are very lucky to have her. So, Jenny, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Anne. It's an honor to be here. It's so great to see all your familiar smiling faces and new faces up there. I have to say, this is like, I was just telling our folks earlier that this is such an honor to be able to moderate this discussion tonight. And you're not going to hear very much from me because you have such fascinating women here to talk about a topic that I think is really, for better or for worse, on the minds of many people. I unfortunately was not able to be there when we awarded our big grant to Penelope's organization last year, but I was telling her, and I'm coming clean, that I did vote for her. And I was really delighted to see that she won. I just think the work that you do is so incredibly important and is directly making an impact on people's lives. And Jenny, getting to meet you. First of all, I love meeting someone else who's a Jenny. I'm going to change my little name here to Jenny as we go along, because we've got to claim it. And I love listening to you and listening to how you're careful, thoughtful, non-biased, objective, and transparent journalism, both from AMU, but also just from you. And I really had an opportunity over the last couple of days to listen to a lot of the reporting that Jenny is doing, and it is people-centered reporting, and it is about how policies and trends and statistics really impact real people's lives. So that's our goal tonight. We're going to talk about policy. We're going to talk about sort of politics, a little politics. We're going to talk about some facts, but we're really going to try to focus on how it impacts people's lives. So I'm just going to open up, which is, I hate to do this in some ways, but open up with just a couple of stats to kind of set the table here. And it was actually incredibly timely that we picked this time to do this panel, because on Monday of this week, the mayor of DC issued a public emergency on two issues that she says the pandemic has worsened in the district: the deadly opioid epidemic, and what she says is a rise in youth violence. And in that order, she states, and I'm quoting now, "The district is experiencing an increase in violent crime, particularly among youth. In the first 9 months of 2023, there have been 458 arrests of juveniles for robbery, including carjacking, homicide, or assault with a deadly weapon, 10% more than the total number of such arrests in all of 2022. A total of 151 juveniles have been arrested for carjackings, which represents 1/3 of all the carjacking arrests. The number of district youth victimized by violent crime has also increased significantly. Between January and October of 2023, 97 juveniles suffered gunshot wounds, including 15 homicides, which is a 9% increase from the same period in 2022. And then she goes on to say, in just the last 5 weeks, 5 youth under the DC Superior Court of the District of Columbia's Family Court Services Division electronic monitoring have been killed. This violence is having a devastating impact on victims, their families, communities, and the district as a whole." That's the end of me quoting from her order. So I would like to ask each of you what you make of these statistics, and why did the mayor issue this order like now when she issued it? Maybe I'll start with you, Jenny, and then go over to Penelope.
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much, Jenny, for moderating tonight. Yeah, so to zoom out a bit, just beyond the youth numbers, homicides overall have been spiking in DC this year. They're up 32% over last year, which was already a very difficult year for gun violence. We've been seeing more than 200 homicides a year for a few years now, and those are numbers we haven't seen since about 2003. 243 people have been murdered in DC so far this year. So I bring that statistic in just to add this context that homicides and gun violence in the city is still mostly driven by adults. And I think that's important to note. And this trauma, it cascades obviously across the whole city, but it's extremely unequal too. It's most concentrated in neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River. With that said, there has also been this incredibly tragic rise in the victimization of youth and in youth involvement in violence, which has again been extremely traumatic, extremely concerning, and also extremely unequal. In my reporting, I've met educators who have lost multiple students to gun violence, right? Mentors who have lost multiple mentees, kids who have now lost more than one friend. So the mayor said she issued this public emergency order on youth violence in recognition of the fact that this rise in youth violence is in fact an emergency. Practically, though, it's a little bit small in scope. So what the order does largely focuses on speeding up a renovation project that's going to make more bed space available at one of DC's youth detention facilities. And then it's also going to make it easier for the city to quickly contract with providers to open up some new shelter homes, or what they're called. It's basically housing that's in the community for young people accused of crimes where they're ordered to stay pre-trial, but where they have a little bit more flexibility than or actually a lot more flexibility than they do in a secure facility. So they would still be able to go to school, their normal school, for example, and eat lunch with their friends there. So that's sort of what the mayor's public emergency focuses on, specifically kind of speeding up these procurement processes, and then taking a closer look at operations at DC's youth detention facility. And that's kind of in response to some concerns about capacity that have been raised in recent months.
Got it. Penelope, any thoughts on that? I mean, you don't have to repeat the specifics, but from where you sit, why, what's your reaction to are you seeing the same kind of bump up in your own statistics? And do you have some thoughts about why the mayor did it now?
Sure. Well, I think it is really important to look at these numbers much more broadly. And I think that, when we give raw numbers of arrests or incidents, it's frightening for those who are not kind of looking at the overall trends, looking at the data charts, because each and every one of those numbers that you cited, those are real lives, and those are real lives that have been impacted and traumatized. And so, even if we had 1 or 5, it would be traumatic incidents that would probably, raise the concern of anyone who hears the specifics of those cases. I have been working in DC's juvenile justice system since 2003. I established Open City Advocates in 2005. And I say that because I've really seen the trends over now nearly 2 decades. And, I was looking at some of the arrest rates of young people since I've been doing this work. And back in 2009, when we were truly in a serious crisis, we had over 4,000 young people arrested annually. So then in 2021, we were about 1,400, and now we are in an uptick of a little bit over 1,700. I think maybe it's a little bit higher than that. So although that is an increase in these last 2 to 3 years, if you actually look back over 5, 10, or 20 years, we're still on a very significant decline in terms of overall youth arrest rates. I do think, however, our young people are experiencing and showing the signs of trauma that they carried through the pandemic. And I think many of us are ready to move on from the pandemic. We're kind of tired of talking about it. We learned our own individual lessons and we want to move on. But the young people who were in relatively maybe toxic environments or challenging environments, and certainly places where a lot of the services that they used to rely on all disappeared all at once, at a time when they were learning how to be successful adolescents who were able to navigate our city services, and navigate through the systems in which they would normally navigate, right? The school system, perhaps the health systems, the mental health systems, all of those services have been impacted. So it's no surprise to me that we are seeing, an uptick since the start of the pandemic. And I think it is sad that we are now looking at this and calling this an epidemic of youth crime, because if I looked at it, or another way to cast it is an epidemic of services and a failure of our government systems to be adequately coordinating and linking young people and their families to services. So that's what I'm seeing overall. I think that sadly, this the order that Jenny was mentioning, that the mayoral order here really is not in any way, in my view, addressing youth crime. It is responding after crime occurs. And sadly, it's responding with the most traumatic and severe sanctions, which is, increasing the beds in a secure juvenile locked facility that is chronically understaffed. And part of the challenge is that we haven't placed the community-based supports that we need in order to serve young people in the city. Instead, it's sadly oftentimes easier to build 10 more beds than to link 10 more children to mental health services. But the cost, both the financial and the human cost behind that, are astronomical. We're talking probably upwards of $100,000 to incarcerate a young person for a year. And if I could use those $100,000 to connect our young people to services and ensure that they have the financial supports they need to be successful, I guarantee that would be far more impactful than locking them up.
I definitely want to come back to sort of the way to treat this and causation, because Jenny's done some really interesting reporting on some stuff, and I know you guys have as well. But before we get there, I just want to quickly go back a little bit and dive a little bit deeper into. My background is politics, so I'm always wondering why politicians do things when they do them. And one of the things that the politicians do react to is sunlight from the media, like things that are in the paper, things that people are talking about. I guess I'm talking a little bit more like a citizen here too, but I do think the headlines about the sort of the rise in youth and carjacking. There was a really horrific, I guess like a couple weeks ago, there was 2 deaths that happened. One was an officer was shot, a youth carjacker, and another one, I think it was a girl who was in part of a carjacking experience, got killed in a car crash. And that story kind of like went the rounds around all of the city. And then there's also been a lot of concern. I think Penelope and Jenny, you guys both kind of alluded to this. There were some very critical media reports about overcrowding in these facilities, which may be why the mayor's report responsive. And I'm not trying to jump on the mayor, but it would be probably helpful to give a little bit of context about some of these things, because again, they seem to be things that are sexy is the wrong word, but like get a lot of social media. It could go viral without maybe necessarily facts behind them, or it's a new kind of crime that people aren't used to, or the fact that young people who don't even have licenses are doing it. I don't know. Like, I would love to hear what you guys have to say about like those 2 things, because I do think those are things that have people are talking about in the community. Well, probably people have been talking about a long time, but are new to some people in the community.
Well, I think, Jenny, I'll let you speak to the media and I think the impact that has had. But I think that one thing that we oftentimes look at is how to hold young people accountable. And unfortunately, I think that we probably need to do a lot more to hold our systems accountable. And I think that on the eve of the mayor's order here, the city was on the verge of being held in contempt of court for systemic failures that have been far-reaching for many, many months, if not years. We're probably going back to last fall at least. And that's something that we see in our organization all the time. We have young people who are held in facilities, and they're in the secure facilities when they have actually been deemed the appropriate placement for them is a medium level or a level where they can be in the community and receive those community-based supports. So it was only at the point that because we have been over-relying on our secure systems and not building out our medium level and community-based services, that that now the district is at risk of being held in contempt. So sadly, I think much of this is because finally the some of our government systems were on the brink of being held accountable. So I will say also, I think if I can just talk a little bit about the trends I've seen over the last 20 years is the importance of media and reporting and the access that we have to data. When back in 2009, 2010, when crime and juvenile crime in particular was incredibly high, probably quadruple what it is now, we didn't have Twitter where you could follow every MPD feed about horrific events that were going on. And certainly some of those would get out in the media, but now we have, the next door and our community listservs, and every car break-in, every crime that happens feels very personal, and it feels very close because we are very close to that data. And I think that is exactly why, it's been such a delight to work with Jenny over these past few months, because the importance of balanced reporting can't be overstated, and it really does very, very clearly affect the policy and the response that our city has to these issues.
Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, I agree that media attention has a lot of different effects, some of them negative and some of them positive. I think one thing about the media focus on carjacking that's kind of been interesting to me, that I've been thinking about a lot, is, some academics have pointed out in other cities, and done some analysis, basically, all we know with carjackings, these crimes are notoriously difficult to solve. It's really hard to solve a carjacking, and MPD does not clear a lot of these cases, right? So when we look at who's arrested for carjackings, we're looking at a relatively small percentage of the total, right? And there's some academics who suggest that, kids are worse at driving. There are all sorts of reasons why kids get easier to catch, right? So it doesn't mean, though, that there hasn't been a rise in young people involved in carjacking. I think that's really, really clear. So I don't want to, say that, but I just add, there's some context to these numbers, and we don't know everything. But yes, this order did come just a few hours. I was in court that morning at Superior Court watching a contempt hearing in which the head of DC's Juvenile Justice Agency had to testify on this issue of them not having enough space in these shelter homes, and so them illegally detaining youth at the Youth Services Center. And that's exactly what happened to this girl who is accused of being involved in the carjacking, and a pair of carjackings in which another teen girl died in the car crash. And so that's sort of been happening with that court case. But the judge in that case pointed out that, she had been raising this issue about a lack of shelter home space since last December, and she hadn't seen much action from DC government to address that problem. And so anyway, this speeding up of procurement partially is to address that issue that's being talked about in court. So that is sort of how this all kind of ties together a bit, if that makes sense.
Oh no, yeah, that was really helpful context for me, because in my research, that's why I asked the question. It just seemed all to be within 2 weeks of each other. You know what I mean? There was all together like that. So that was pretty interesting. And I don't want to pick on the mayor because she's trying to solve problems. I do think that in my research, it seems like there has, to your point, Penelope, been a lot of questions about us not having enough resources, shelter beds, just the sort of agencies not talking to each other. The DC Policy Center did a report, and I'm going to kind of ask a question I didn't give you guys in advance, but I think you can react to it. They did a report at the DC Policy Center on juvenile justice and juvenile crime. And I have links for all these things that I read that I'll put in the chat, so you guys can all listen to them and read them too. But one of the things that one of the experts that they talked to in there said that one of the reasons why juvenile crime may be going up is because of silos between agencies. And the silos, they said that they gave a bunch of different solutions here. And maybe you guys can talk about some of these solutions that they talked about. One was increased investment in early intervention and prevention. And Jenny, you did a story, I'm going to kind of cue you up, about violence prevention mini grants. I mean, that's not the be all and end all, but it's an interesting program. Just a story about that back in March. Then they talked about reducing the silos that have arisen among the agencies who oversee juvenile crime on the DC, but also on the federal level. And they talked a little bit about how DC is kind of odd because we should be a state, but we're not a state. And so there's lots of agency confusion there. And then there's what, Penelope, you guys have been working on for a long time, which is more support for youth in and when they're in the system and after they've been in the system. So are those areas that you think could be helpful in deterring, and can you talk a little bit more about them? Each of you, maybe we'll start with Jenny on this one, just because I referenced those mini grants.
Yeah, so those mini grants have been being distributed for a few years now under a program called Building Blocks. They're small. They're like $5,000 at a time to just like small community-based organizations, and maybe people who like don't have a formal nonprofit or something, or would be intimidated by trying to apply for a large grant, but who sort of get a chance to get a grant through this, and maybe it empowers them to apply for more grants in the future. And I've definitely seen some people, change lives through that grant. There's in particular one woman in a neighborhood like historic Anacostia, or some people call it Chapa City, like that has been doing a skills resume, like workforce life skills training is what she calls it, with people in that neighborhood. And I've heard really great feedback. I heard from someone who is now back in school because of it. And so I think that those grants have been really interesting to watch. I mean, I think the one criticism of the program is that it sort of is that DC has a lot of different programs and a lot of different sort of approaches, but maybe there's less coordination among those approaches than people would like to see. So that's sort of one criticism I've seen of that program. But I think in general, I mean, in terms of what works, one thing I've been thinking a lot about, and Penelope, I think you know more about this than I do because you were actually watching DC's juvenile justice system really closely during this time. But there was a group of reformers who did come in and take over DYRS at one point, basically after the city had been embroiled in a really intense class action lawsuit over horrific facilities at its old juvenile detention facility, Oak Hill. There was a group of people who came in and they came from backgrounds that weren't like traditional corrections backgrounds. And they basically, their philosophy was that like, we are going to place the investment less in the secure facility and more in the community. So they really put an emphasis on like redistributing the funds of the agency to people in the community, and like the people in the community who have in these informal, they don't have like an official job title, right? But maybe they like work with kids already and they could use some extra support to do that. And that, all that sort of reform work was also being done at a time when crime among young people was steadily going down. And so a lot of people do see that as an argument that like these sort of non-carceral approaches can be effective and have been in the past. And I think there are still a lot of people who are doing that kind of work and who are getting, varying degrees of government support for that work too. So, I mean, DC does have, a history of sort of trying to invest in people who are working with kids in their own communities and who have credibility like in their communities, but maybe not like an official government title, if that makes sense. But I would love Penelope to add more.
Please, Penelope.
Well, I could kind of go on on this one. I'll do my best to not ramble too long here. First, Jenny Backus, you mentioned the different silos that that impact our young people, and both the local and the federal division here. And I think that's incredibly important. I think some of the cases that have recently hit the news that you had mentioned were talking about what happened with young people who were on GPS monitoring under court social services probation. So to back up just a little bit, in DC, if a young person is committed of a crime or found involved in an act of delinquency, the judge can either place the young person on court social services probation, which is the probation that you all likely can envision. This is placement at home, sometimes on electronic monitoring, and basically receiving services in the community with a probation officer, regular check-ins. And then there's the option for the more severe punishment, which is commitment to the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. And that is a DC city government agency. So when we look at early intervention or lesser interventions, that in the court system is typically happening through that federal system. We do not have oversight of that. We have a really hard time getting any data on that. So even just the numbers of young people who are on GPS, what is the impact of that? What are the outcomes that the court social services probation is delivering? So oftentimes what we see, is a failure in our individual cases of young people on probation, again, because the adults who are meant to be serving them and connecting them to services are not doing always the most fabulous of jobs. And then therefore the court then resentences a young person to the commitment to the city agency. So what that essentially does is funnel young people into the deepest end of our system, the most severe end of our system, where incarceration is much more likely. And sadly, incarceration is far less has far less of an impact on turning young people's lives around than the less invasive responses to delinquency. I will say also that there's a level of silos in terms of the support systems, even in our city agencies. So one of the things my organization has been doing for the last few years is really looking at the intersection of young people in the child welfare system through Child and Family Services Agency, and then the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, because again, we can't look at the probation because we don't have oversight there. But the DC auditor is currently undertaking an audit of what we call crossover youth. So the number of young people that cross over from the child welfare system who have been abused and neglected, who have suffered severe trauma, and that is manifesting oftentimes in acts of delinquency. And then they're not able to get the support services, for example, through the Department of Behavioral Health. So oftentimes what we see for young people who are being discharged from our secure facilities after months of intensive programming and theoretically an individualized service plan, which sadly fails quite often, is they're told that upon release, they need to call the city, they just need to call the DBH, the Department of Behavioral Health intake line. So there's nobody there that's setting that up before release, that's ensuring that actually happens after release. And often, and that's just one example of the types of services that our young people need and are absolutely siloed, and it's placed on their responsibility to seek out those services and make sure that connection occurs, as opposed to the adults who are meant to be shepherding them through these various silos. And anyone who's dealt with the DMV or any other government agency knows that there's always a bureaucracy, there's always a hiccup, and asking our young people whose life skills have not been developed as fully as even some better adjusted young people, in part because we've locked them up and denied them those opportunities to build those skills through our system. So in terms of, I think I'll stop right there, because unless there was a particular, I think there was another aspect of that question, but.
Yeah, well, no, but just to add to that, because I do know that you guys have been successful in advocating to get more services or more help to juveniles, especially after they've been committed. And I read that thanks to Open City and you, Penelope, DC is the first jurisdiction in the county to have a post-commitment attorney for juveniles. Now, that's not a person that can call the Department of Behavioral Health, but that seems like a pretty significant thing. Why was this an important thing for you to fight for? And why is it important for youth?
Sure. Well, I thank you for that question. It's been near and dear to my heart for nearly 20 years now. So essentially, in the District of Columbia, if young people are committed to the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, they can be under city supervision up until age 21. And that doesn't always mean that they're incarcerated up until age 21, but they may be cycling through group homes, out-of-state residential facilities, our long-term secure facility, which is called New Beginnings. Oftentimes, if they have violated the terms of their community agreement, for example, not charging their GPS device, they can find themselves back at the Youth Services Center, where Jenny has been doing a lot of reporting. This is why the facilities and the conditions there are so important to me, is because some of my clients are cycling back through there. So what we were seeing is that DC has some really fabulous defense attorneys, and they do great work in court through the trial and the sentencing phase of juvenile court. But then if a young person was committed to the city agency, let's say they were committed at the age of 15, they would be under supervision for 6 years and did not have legal counsel during that time. And so not only could their placement change so severely, right, going from home to secure facility to group home to out of state, oftentimes with almost no, they had no representation, and the court had very little very little control over what could happen. It really was nearly unbridled discretion at the hands of the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. So young people's liberty and the services that they were supposed to be receiving was going really unchecked. And so what we determined that we thought that young people deserved to have legal counsel throughout that entire period of supervision. And that is the court case we won in the DC Court of Appeals in 2020. I think the reason that, in addition to ensuring that youth have a voice in what is happening to them, the types of services that they feel would be beneficial to them, allowing their family members to really weigh in, and that's something that legal counsel can do to make sure that those concerns or those needs are elevated. It also really holds our system accountable to delivering services. You know, we talk a lot about rehabilitation, and if there's no check on our system to make sure that the young people are receiving the services that they need, they oftentimes don't. So as just one example of this, I think mental health is so important. 90% of the young people who have been committed to the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services have a diagnosed mental health need. Less than 40% of those children receive the individualized services that have been outlined in their very own plan that the city has written for them. So we are absolutely failing these young people, and then to hold them accountable for a failure to rehabilitate, in air quotes here, is really unfair when it is the adults and the systems who have failed to provide them the underlying services that they need to address those needs that really drove them into the delinquency system in the first place. So that's what Open City Advocates does, is really make sure that young people have a voice throughout that entire process, that we're able to get issues back into court, which children otherwise wouldn't know how to do that. There's not really an easy mechanism for them to come back to court and say, hey, I've been stuck at the Youth Services Center for 11 months unlawfully. I was supposed to go to a group home and I'm still here because DC claims not to have a bed for me, or there's all sorts of other reasons there, but that is inherently traumatizing to young people and exacerbating their needs, and sadly will make our city a much less safe place if they're not receiving the services that they're supposed to receive.
I want to push out a little bit and go to you, Jenny, a little bit more on the notion of transparency and oversight and accountability. Because Penelope, that definitely strikes a chord for what you're talking about. You guys have both kind of referenced this juvenile justice office. And that was another thing that sort of came out. Although I understand it was announced that the mayor was going to close this independent juvenile justice facilities oversight office, and now she may not be. But Jenny, talk a little bit about like that, but in the context of transparency and oversight and accountability, because it's that seems clear to be something that is needed, because we're not, and again, not these agencies are overwhelmed, there's resources. I mean, everybody's sort of fighting with the same problems, but it sounds like there have been some problems in the system along the way. And if we don't have sunlight, I think it's hard to fix them.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go like way back, like decades back, because I think it's helpful to understand what's going on like lately. So in the 1980s, there was this big class action lawsuit filed against the city over decrepit, horrible, abusive conditions in its old juvenile detention facility. The case is called Jerry M. It went on for 35 years, basically. Over, for that whole 35 years, basically, DC's juvenile justice system was under court monitoring, which meant that, that's built-in intense oversight, right? Where the judge would make an order, right? And they have to do something, they have to make changes. And so over that time, DC's juvenile justice system underwent a lot of reforms. They closed that agency, they closed that facility, Oak Hill, which had more than 200 beds, right, Penelope? And then they opened New Beginnings, which is a way smaller facility. That's the time period over which I was describing this process of kind of like divesting from the locked facility and trying to funnel more money into the community. There were a lot of changes. And by 2020, when that court oversight was lifted because a judge decided DC had come a long way, it didn't need it anymore, and the parties agreed on a settlement, things had changed a lot. And in many ways, like, DC had become considered by many to be a gold standard in juvenile justice. As part of the end of that, okay, thank you, Penelope, for the clarification in the chat. So it had 180 beds, but it was regularly over that capacity, housing more than 200 kids. So as part of the agreement that ended that court monitoring, the Mayor Bowser, had to open a new oversight office. It's an independent monitoring agency that had unfettered access to DC's like locked facilities for youth. So this is the Youth Services Center, the pretrial detention facility, and then New Beginnings, which is like the post-commitment facility where kids go after they're convicted of crimes and they're sent to sort of the deepest end of DC's juvenile justice system. So that monitoring agency was created. It opened in January of 2021, and it was ordered by the court that it be open for 3 years. So the sunset date for that agency is January 2024. So a couple months from now, basically. And it came out last week that Mayor Bowser's administration had decided not to extend that agency. They were given the authority, like the lawsuit settlement said, keep it open for at least 3 years, after which the mayor can choose to extend or not extend it. So it's clearly within Mayor Bowser's authority to not keep this office open. The thing about this office is that it's really a unique resource. I mean, especially for me as a reporter, because it's a two-person office, but they have this unfettered access to the facility where they can interview staff, they can interview youth who are detained there, and report out. They have a lot of data, and they publish data that DYRS, the DC's Juvenile Justice Agency, doesn't publish or has declined to publish. So it's a really important source of information, and independent information, right? They don't have to get permission from anybody in the administration before they speak to the media, for example. They don't have to get like approval or sign off before they publish a report. They always give the administration the courtesy of reading the report and responding to it or disputing anything in it, but they can do whatever they want. And I think it's really valuable, especially as a reporter. I don't have access, right? I can't just go into this facility, just like I can't go into the DC jail, which I also cover. But Mark Jordan, the executive director of this office, he can, right? And then he can report back on what he sees, and it's just valuable. It's another source, right? So like, as I'm sourcing these stories, I'm really relying on kind of 3 categories of people, which is basically, the independent monitor, defense attorneys and advocates who have clients in the facility, and in some cases, like parents who have children in the facility who can talk. But otherwise, I don't have access. So anyway, this decision was made to sort of let it sunset. But then after that, the mayor said on Monday that she was actually still assessing, and she was talking with council members who had sort of raised the issue with her the week before. 3 council members are now planning to introduce emergency legislation to extend that office for longer, at least through the end of the fiscal year when it's funded. So this current situation is it's very much now back in flux.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Well, that looks like it's an office that helps bring information out, which then can lead to reform, which impacts policy because obviously council members are relying on it. What are some other things that both of you are seeing in DC that are working? Because I know there's a lot of bad news out there, but what are some things that are happening both nationally, but here in DC in the field of juvenile justice that are giving you some hope? And you know, yeah, just build out on that a little bit if you could. Penelope?
Sure. Well, let me start with, I think the thing that is most near and dear to my heart. My organization actually started under the name of Mentoring Today because we really see the value of mentoring and human connection, personal connection, that is a unique relationship with a young person, and really ensures a individualized relationship as opposed to cookie cutter services. And so I think that mentoring is incredibly important, not only to heal that the relationship with the community and really forge positive connections, but also what we call oftentimes is to link our young people to what we call social capital. So this is really some of our mentors are individuals who, you know, may have a connection at the zoo for a young person who is really interested in animal care and can help that young person get their very first internship at a vet or at a zoo or, you know, whatever it is. It's really looking to the individual talents and strengths of a young person and trying to find ways to leverage those. And so any of us who have been successful in our careers or our education, I'm sure you can think of a whole handful of individuals who connected you to other folks who helped you along your way in your career path. So I think that human connection is key. We have something called credible messengers. This is really young or individuals who have been impacted by the juvenile or adult criminal legal system, who are then reaching back out and trying to help young people not follow that same path. And one thing that's really important about the way that they operate is they're really what I think of as gap fillers. So often we'll find a young person, Jenny mentioned earlier, might be at a shelter home and allow them to go to their neighborhood school. Well, the shelter home isn't necessarily in the same neighborhood as their neighborhood school. And so, how we're putting a young person in a shelter house in upper Northwest DC, but their neighborhood school is in deep, Ward 8, and how are they getting across town? And so sometimes credible messengers, they're giving the ride, across town. And that car ride I've found can be incredibly useful time with a young person. That's where you can really, feel relaxed. You're not having that direct one-on-one eye contact. You can really just, what comes to the fore, and you can really understand what's going on in a young person's life. I'll also say that I think direct financial investment is something that can make an enormous difference. And this is something that we've seen here locally. And then I think it's also happening a lot more federally. After the pandemic, the federal government issued what we call ARPA funds. It's the American Rescue Protection Act, I think. Anyways, our organization received over $300,000 of ARPA funds, and those are direct money that we put directly into the hands of our young people and their family members. And that is to do things like pay for, we have one young man who wanted to become an electrician. And not only were we able to pay for his training there, we actually bought him his tools, the tools that he needed so that he could then go out on an apprenticeship. And, when we are able to financially support our young people in their vocational goals, their employment, housing, filling those gaps, that they can just make a critical difference. Because I have yet, in my 19 years of working in this field, met somebody who is just an evil person who wants to create harm in the community. Crime happens oftentimes, most often, from poverty and a lack of opportunity. And, young people, if they're really given the opportunity to pursue what they actually want, that's why that youth voice is so important. And they're given the tools and the financial support to do that, they will, and they will, very quickly turn away from criminal activity. So I think we really need to look more at that flexible funding model and really addressing the financial needs of our young people and their families. And then lastly, I'll just say, again, mental health services, not in secure facilities. Secure facilities are probably the worst place that we could possibly provide mental health facilities. Anyone who has engaged in any sort of counseling knows the importance of feeling safe. And when you are feeling raw and open, and you're doing that in a locked environment, where after you have, poured your, you've opened up, you've been vulnerable, and now you need to go back into a locked, group where, your physical safety is threatened. That is not a place where you want to be vulnerable and weak. So, I had a young man who I drove him every week from Southeast DC over to the Went Center on Connecticut Avenue in Upper Northwest, and just providing him safe transport and a loving and caring ear to do that. And then afterwards, we would go out to ice cream every single time. And it was just like, he could be a kid. We could go have ice cream. He could be vulnerable. If he had, teary eyes, that was okay, because we had another 40-minute drive across town for him to pull himself to get ready, to put his armor back on and head back into that tough world that he was living in. So I think making sure that we not only just like make the actual connections, but we provide the ancillary supports that make those meaningful services that our young people will actually engage in. And that's done through that individual connection. That's why, again, I came back to the mentoring as the start.
I'd love to hear, Jenny, like you build on that, but I mean, it reminds me of what you were saying about those mini grants, like, or what you were saying earlier, Penelope, about not official, just sort of people in the community who give services to kids. And it really seems like the way to solve this problem is one-on-one, small investments leading to bigger investments. Not to say that big investments aren't good, but you know what I'm saying? Like it's a person-to-person thing, and a problem that looks, in many ways, sometimes is portrayed as a sea of stuff coming at you, and it's really, you've got to take a minute to look at the individual. But I don't want to. I'm editorializing, and I don't want to. So Jenny, please talk.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on the subject of hope, it is really easy, obviously, to read the news and feel really sad. And there are, like, I've covered a lot of really devastating things and devastating tragedies in people's lives, but I also have met a lot of people who, like, they're devoting their whole lives, right, to like helping young people in the city and to trying to address these problems. And yeah, these are people who like might have an official like government title or job, but they are also people who just like come out of their pockets and drive kids places where they need to go, right? Or and talking to young people themselves is always really inspiring too. Young people in the city are so smart and cool and interesting, and like have huge hearts. So I think, and have really great ideas actually about what they want to see change in the city. I think within government, I mean, there are a few like interesting things happening. My colleague, she's not my editor actually, but she was a reporter for us until a few years ago when she became an editor, and she published a story a couple of years ago about a restorative justice program being run out of the Office of the Attorney General, which is pretty interesting. And like early data showed that, for the cases that they selected, they would sort of give a young person an opportunity to have a restorative justice conference with the person who had been a victim of their crime in some way, right? A person maybe they had stolen from or something like that. And early early data was showing that those kids who went through restorative justice were having better outcomes, less recidivism than kids who did not go through that same process. And in many cases, like victims, actually, it can be a more satisfying process for them because it sort of centers their experience more. So I think that there's like interesting innovation happening around that in DC. And then sort of one thing that I'll be watching with the administration in the coming, months and year or so or more, is there has sort of been a charge put down from the mayor to figure out a better way to reach and connect with families and young people who like have concerns before they become justice involved or get arrested. And so I guess maybe this isn't like hopeful thing, but I'm just interested to see sort of like what they come up with and what they implement, and if they can sort of come up with something that could start helping people in that position, because that's something we hear about all the time. Basically, like that there are parents who are sort of crying out for earlier intervention, but sort of don't know where or how to get that.
That's really fascinating. And I didn't know about that restorative justice program. I've seen that in a couple of other cities, but I didn't know that we had it here too. I think that's also really important too. Okay, I have one more kind of question about like getting people involved in this. And then I want to talk a little bit about how people like us can help people like you, Penelope. And if you have thoughts, Jenny, jump in too, but that more direct question there. But when I was doing this research, I actually spent last weekend up in Vermont with my dad, who caught COVID. He's 81. He's in the beginning of Alzheimer's. He and his wife got COVID. So all of the sisters were kind of keeping an eye on them. And so we were watching a lot of Celtics games because he's a huge Celtics fan. And the Celtics did a whole little thing on the New England cable network about how they and Jaylen Brown are pushing legislation in the state, which I've never seen the Celtics in my 55 years of cheering for them. Didn't know they got behind legislation. And Jaylen Brown is one of their big players. And they did some public stuff, in their TV time, talking about a bill called Raise the Age, which will gradually raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction to 18 to 20 years. And we may already have that here in DC, but they said that one of the reasons they thought it would be successful is because it would allow youth in the prison system to stay in school. So to keep going to school after, supposedly they would have graduated at 18, which reduces recidivism. Are we doing anything like that here in the district? I mean, and sort of more importantly, and maybe more topically for both of you, how important is it to involve organizations and leaders kind of beyond the politicians, beyond the agencies, in addressing juvenile justice concerns, or involving people that kids are listening to? Every answer is not a celebrity, but if people have relationships with churches or musicians or things that kids are interested in, local sort of heroes, is that something that you've seen it when you were talking earlier about Penelope mentoring? Is that helpful? Is it important to get kind of bigger people to speak out to guilt politicians? I guess I'm walking away from listening to you guys talk with like a sense of what more can I do, and like who else can we get involved in this? And this is it's not a crisis, but this is something that we each have the power to have an impact to do something about. So I guess I'm kind of interested. You don't necessarily have to react to this bill per se, but like the general notion of like how important it is to get, sports heroes involved in this kind of stuff.
Well, I'm not sure about sports heroes, but and maybe Jenny has some ideas on that. I'd love it. That'd be great. I think anyone who is raising progressive solutions to what some of the challenges are in our juvenile and adult systems, I welcome that. That would be fabulous. I am often really pushing to have young people and families involved in developing the solutions. I think, we oftentimes talk about the challenges of our medical system, for example, and it would be like trying to improve our health systems without ever including the voice of patients. So, certainly getting individuals who are currently in the system or at risk of the system or have been touched by it is absolutely imperative. I think that I love this movement to raise the age. I think that for those of us who are enmeshed in this field, we do a lot of reading about the adolescent brain development research, and adolescent brains don't finish developing until age 25. So I think that I would love to see our justice systems comport with the brain research that we have that is really been changing some aspects of the legal system. For example, doing away with death penalty for juveniles, juvenile life without parole. That is all really grounded in the adolescent brain development science. So I certainly, I would like our justice systems to kind of right size themselves or comport with what that science is. I think that certainly the ability to engage in education is so important. And simply to avoid the trauma of the adult justice system. I think anyone who has spent some time in jail, has a loved one who's been in jail, or just had any real contact there, it'll break your heart. I mean, my very first day in Oak Hill Youth Center, which is subsequently closed, very incarceral setting, I didn't stop crying for 24 hours after I went into that facility, and it changed my life forever and was the reason that I started this organization. So I think the fact that I can personally say that I experienced trauma that day just by being in that facility, and I got to go home at night. I wasn't in one of those cells. But the fact that we do that to young people, and I will include 18 to 20-year-olds as young people, and I would like to push it up to age 25, but not only to be able to access their education, but all the other supports and allow their minds to develop, and that we punish or address their actions accordingly, grounded in the fact that they likely were not as capable of really having the foresight to understand the impact of their actions. I'm not going to excuse them for the behavior necessarily, but just say that I think exacerbating the trauma that they've lived by pushing them into the adult system doesn't do any of us any good, and is something that I think we should look at. I do think that one of the challenges here in the district is that federal and local divide. We have the adult prosecutor is federal, the juvenile prosecutor is local. There's just some real challenges there that those of us who are in the field, we're constantly looking at what are various workarounds and what could we potentially get Congress to support in this regard as well. So there's that gets super in the weeds and complicated. So I probably too much for this call.
Any thoughts there, Penelope? If not, we'll just end up with, but please do. But if not, the last question is one for Jenny, sorry. The last question, Penelope, just when we close out, we'll go to questions. We've got one question in the chat. We may get another one, what can people here at Impact do in addition to supporting you financially, which I urge everyone to do, and we have as an organization, but also individually? What are other things do you need more mentors? Are there things that people can do, or where should they go to look for ways that they can help?
Sure. Well, I would say the first step is to continue to educate yourself on these issues and engage in the conversation. So I love Jenny's reporting. I would say follow her on Twitter and really read deeply into those articles, and I think amplify the messages that those of us who are really trying to get at root causes and solutions that will actually address those needs. If you can elevate those, we're really in a battle right now of the narrative and this get tough on crime, which is sadly not going to make us safe. In terms of our organization, in addition to amplifying those messages on social media and engaging with us, we use all sorts of skilled volunteers. So I think sometimes we don't look deeply enough into kind of what are the skills that we have that might support a nonprofit organization. So we have fabulous volunteers who are developing these like super intricate spreadsheets for us in terms of delivering that direct cash assistance that I was mentioning before. We have human resources specialists who advise us on, our next hires and how can we make sure that we're advertising the places that we need to in order to, recruit the skills that we need. Board members, advisory board members. If you have a skill, whether you think it's relevant or not, reach out and we'll see if we can find a place for you. Just like we work with our young people from a place of individuality and like what can we do to meet their unique needs. I love to meet with individuals and find out what their unique skills are and figure out a way that we can leverage those.
That's great. All right, I'm going to go to questions because I of course talk too much, and we've got two. One of our members, Janelle, has a question, but I'm going to read one that was in the chat. We actually have an Impact100 Philly member here, so that is amazing. Kenyatta Posey asks, how has gentrification impacted responses to youth crime and delinquency? Maybe I'll start with Jenny on that and then go to Penelope quickly after that.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. In terms of how it's affected the responses, I feel like I don't have a great answer to that. Penelope might, but I know just from my reporting that gentrification and just DC's housing crisis, there are a lot of intersections between that and crime. Like extremely tragically, one of the youth homicides I reported on this year, I spoke with a mother who had lost her son, and she had been trying to move out of that neighborhood for a really long time and could not, right? Because it's really, really, really hard in the city to find affordable housing right now. And, that problem has intensified and intensified. So that is one like really sort of big intersection, I would say. And then in the aftermath, right? In the aftermath of a trauma like that, she has other kids that she would still like to not live in that neighborhood. And it's unclear sort of like whether she'll be able to like make a permanent move. It's really hard for families. And that's, she's far from the only person who's experienced that. I hear that from many people. So that's sort of one big way that I see housing intersecting and gentrification intersecting with this issue. But Penelope, would be curious what you have to add.
I couldn't agree more with the housing. I think the failures of our city to provide adequate housing and safe housing, it is the single most driver, I think, of the young people into the system, I would say, that I've seen. I will say also that I think gentrification oftentimes supports criminal justice measures that are not necessarily helpful for our community. So one of the things that many folks may have heard about is the juvenile curfew that was being enforced, and is still being enforced. And I think oftentimes that is a response to those who have the most power and the loudest voice in our city. And so there are certain areas of our city where seeing groups of young people may feel threatening. And I think it's an easy get tough on crime approach that sadly exacerbates poor relationships between the police and our young people of color, making them feel more targeted and less likely to engage in seeking help from the police when they need it. So I think it has a real direct impact on policy, gentrification and the changing of our neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. That was really interesting answers from both of you. Janelle, do you want to ask your question?
I do. I'm too lazy to type it. So Penelope, early on, you had talked about one of the reasons that the mayor implemented her new programs, no matter what the judgment is on them, is that she was being held accountable. So who is holding them accountable? What does that mean? What does that look like? And how can we, or is there anything we can do to double down on that and encourage accountability? Because without accountability, nothing's going to happen.
It's a great question. And I think oftentimes accountability for the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, for example, merely looks like annual oversight by the DC Council. And when we have when public policy is changing on a near daily basis. Jenny and I are just constantly trying to keep up in what's happening today, what's the new change, that has real impact on our systems. Like our numbers have gone up at the Youth Services Center from, 80 to 90, like overnight. And so I think that goes back to the real importance of having that oversight body that Jenny was talking about before, and ensuring that the public is in support of that. So I think pushing wherever and however we can for data and transparency. My organization is called Open City Advocates, in large part because we believe in transparency, making this an open city. If you look at the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services website, we do not have an annual report from them, I think, for 5 years. We don't have recidivism data for 5 years. That not only doesn't help us hold accountable the agencies that are meant to be serving our young people, it also does an enormous disservice to the service providers that are trying to provide the services. So, for example, for us to get grant funding, for example, we're oftentimes needing to say, well, our recidivism is X, and the city recidivism for youth who don't receive our services is Y. And we used to have that data on a regular, and we were able to say that we cut recidivism rates by over 50%. But if we don't have that comparison data, we don't have the ability to do that, and that hampers the services directly. But I would say, pushing for data, ensuring that we have those oversight offices that are not just at the performance oversight levels that happen, once a year at DC Council, but that we all have regular eyes on and access to the data, and allow our media to have that access as well. That's just key.
Thank you. You guys are wonderful. Thank you.
Jenny, anything you want to add on that?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm sort of in the position of not really, I'm not like an advocate in the same way that Penelope is. So I feel like she's better equipped to answer that question. But yeah, I mean, I feel like, people should have my email, but I can put it in the chat or something. If there are things that you feel aren't being covered, or that you are curious about, or have tips about, or want to know about, just email me. That's my job. So please get in touch.
Yeah, and just to add on that too, I mean, if you think there's information that's not, like I said, don't be afraid to reach out to a reporter or suggest an idea. The worst thing they're going to do is say no. And oftentimes you may have a question that may give them a different way to look at data that they already have in front of them, and give them another viewpoint to get it out there, which is really critical. The last thing I want to say before we just start to wrap up is I want to thank Cynthia Johnson-Boca and urge Penelope to take a look at that chat too. There really good, helpful information about what the Transcendental Meditation Center and the David Lynch Foundation are offering, scholarships and things that might be able to help some of the youth that you guys work with. So thank you. I love folks helping each other and suggesting ideas. We're all living exactly what we're all doing what Penelope just challenged us to do. So that is great. Sharing ideas and networking. And on that note, just to get ready to turn this back over to Anne. I love being able to do this because I learn, but I also really walk away, and especially tonight, thank you to both Penelope and Jenny, because I really think you did an outstanding job of talking about the power of one person can have an impact on somebody else's life, and one small group can have an impact on someone else's life. And sometimes impacts are positive and sometimes they're negative, but getting involved and getting into the system is what has to be done in order to solve the issue that we spent a lot of time talking about here. And asking questions and holding people accountable, which is the role of the media. So I just want to thank you both for all the work that you do every single day. Please know that we are so appreciative of it. And I guess just to wrap it up and turn it back to the impact side, for those of you who may not be members, this is why being part of this organization is so powerful. You may not have time to be on a focus area committee. You may not have time to go to an event, but there are but you do. It is so great that you have opportunities through this organization to hear about organizations like Penelope's, and to understand both the problems that our city is facing and the challenges, but also people that are out there solving. So it is your investment of time and money in impact actually really does make a huge difference. I sound like an NPR, sorry, Jenny, I'm probably having flashbacks, but I just would encourage you. The other thing you can do is get more people to be in Impact 100 so we can give grants like we did to Penelope's organization to some of the people that she works with and some of the people that Jenny reports on. Anne, I will turn it over to you now to take us home.
You said it all. You said it all, Jenny. I want to thank the three of you for a really illuminating discussion on these issues are so complex, and to pack what you all packed in 1 hour is really quite remarkable. Jenny, you have a huge number of fans in the Impact DC group. I can tell you that for sure. And Penelope, you as well. I know that I speak for all of us when I say we are just so fortunate that we can add a bit of fuel to the work that you do. And I'll echo Jenny and say, if you are listening in and not a member of Impact 100 DC, please get in touch with me or with Jenny, or take a look at our website, and we'd love to have you. And with that, I think we're done. I thank all of you for coming, and all of you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.